Hi, in this screencast we are going to talk about objects in JavaScript. Now, JavaScript is an object-oriented language. Now, what does object-oriented language mean? We have seen that JavaScript allows you to declare variables, and JavaScript also allows you to declare functions. Combining variables with functions into a single instance is referred to as an object. And these objects are usually instances of real world, like a person or a bank account or anything that is tangible, anything that is an instance of a real world object. Okay, now this is a basic concept of object-oriented programming, which allows you to encapsulate variables and methods that work together into a single entity. Okay. Now what we are going to do is see how we can create objects in JavaScript. There are different ways of creating objects in JavaScript. Let's see all of them in this screencast. Now let's begin with adding the first way of creating an object in JavaScript is using a notation called as object literal notation. So I'm going to do something like that. Object creation using there is a method called object literal notation, or you can refer to as OLN. Now what do you do over here in this notation? We're creating an object is you create it using exactly the same way that you used to do for variables. You use the var keyword, and then you provide the name of the object. Instead of providing the name of the variable, you provide the name of the object. Okay, let's say I'm going to call this object student, and then we just use the same equal to notation, but this time we're not going to write a value because this is an object which has a combination of values and variables and functions, so we're going to use brackets to do that. Now within these brackets I can declare the variables that I need for that object. So for example over here, each variable, for example, I'm going to say each student has an ID. So the name of the variable is student ID, and then I use a colon and then provide the value for that student ID because it's a real world instance, so I have to use instances. So for example, if I say the ID 2011500060, this is the ID. Okay, so remember the notation that we are using is called the object literal notation, and each object has to be created using the same var keyword that we are using for variables. We use the name of the object over here, say equal to, and then we provide the parentheses, and within that parentheses we have the name of the property or the variable and the value of that variable. Now you can have as many variables as you like, for example, but the only thing is you need to separate them by commas. So for example over here I put this, and then I add name. Okay, if it's a string I'm going to use quotations, and I can go on and on using the same thing. Let's say I'm going to add one more, which is GPA, and say 3.75 and something like that. For the last one you don't need to use a comma because you know that's the last one. Okay, so this is how you create an object. Now this is one half of the object. Later we are going to see how we can add functions to these objects that work on the variables provided by the object. Okay, so this is how we create an object when using the object literal notation. There is another way of creating an object in JavaScript, which I need to show you right now, which is object creation using constructors. Okay, now we have seen how to use constructors in various places, although we might not have mentioned it explicitly, but this is how we do it. Now what do you mean by a constructor? Whenever you create an object of an existing class, but classes are like, you know, generalization of an object. So whenever we want to create an instance of an existing class, and then we have to initialize it with some values. Now this function that initializes the value of an object when you create it for a particular class is called a constructor. We have seen this in arrays. Let me remind you of that. What we did in arrays, how do we create an array? We said that one of the ways of creating an array is var, and then we provide the name of the array. Let's say I'm talking about an array called let's say grades. Okay, I'm talking about an array called grades, and then I used equal to, and then I defined and the new keyword, and then I used the class name, which was array. Okay, so this is something that we did earlier in a previous screencast, where we saw how to create an array in JavaScript. Now what we did over here is the same method. It's a constructor. Array is an already available class for us. We are using that class to initialize or create an instance of that class and call that instance grades. Now since it's an array, it will be bounded by the rules of an array. That means it will work on the functions that is provided by the array class. Similarly, we are going to do the same thing over here. What we need to do is we use var, we provide the name of the object. So let's say I already declared one student using this method. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create another student over here. Let's say student 1 with this one, and this here what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the same notation that I just did, new, and in case the name of the class is object. So this is how I create an object using a constructor. Now you will see that there is a difference. The difference is when using the object literal notation, what I did was I was providing the variables along with the declaration itself. But in this case, I don't have to do that. I can declare the objects, and then I can assign values to these objects later on, or assign values to the variables of these objects later on. Okay, so this is the way we do it. Now let's see how we can assign values. There are two ways of assigning values to the variables in objects. We can use the same thing for an object created with object literal notation, or an object created using the constructor method. It doesn't have to be a specific way. So let's say assigning values to properties, but I'm not going to call them variables, I'm going to call them properties, because usually when you are talking about an object, you're talking about properties and methods of working on those properties. So all these over here, student ID, name, and GPA, are properties. So I'm going to say is assigning values to properties using the dot notation. Okay, this is the first way of doing that. Now how do we do that? Let's say I'm going to assign the first value over here to student 1. So what I need to do to assign that is, the first thing I do is I use the name of the object which I'm using. This is student 1 in this case, and I use a dot. I use a dot over there, and then I decide to use the property that I want to assign that value. So I'm going to say student underscore ID. This is the name of the property, and then I just use equal to, and then I assign the value. For example, I'm going to say 2011500061. Okay, the same thing, student 1 dot name equal to Ahmed. Okay, so this is one of the ways of assigning values using the dot notation, and this is very common. If you recall, we were using this in one of the objects. If you can, I just showed you that array is an object, right? Now in arrays there is one property which is very common. I think you know that. Let me just recall you. It's called length. So if I create an array, I can use the length property to check the length of an array. So you can see that I'm doing the same thing. If student 1 was an array, and student 1 dot length would give me the length of the array. Okay, so that's what the same thing we're doing, is using the same. This is how we are assigning properties. We can use the same thing for actually getting the values of that property. Okay, in this case, for example, if I want to get the value of the property, what I would do is, for example, I'll say document dot write. In this case, I'll say student 1 dot name. So the same way I'm assigning a value is the same way I can retrieve the value from that. Okay, we save that. Let's see how it works like the browser. Okay, Started already. Okay, I'm going to start it eventually. Okay, so you saw that this is Ahmed, that is the which is equal to the name of that second. So this is how you use the properties. This is how we use the properties. Now there's another way of actually using the property, or assigning values to the property or retrieving values from the property, and that way is using the brackets notation. Again, the same one of the things that we used with arrays, values to properties using the brackets notation. Okay, now how do we do that? So student 1, we need to assign a GPA to that. Now instead of using the dot notation, I'm going to use brackets, and within the brackets I'm going to use quotations to declare the name of the property, and then I will use equal to, and then I'll use this property name. For example, in this case I'm going to say 4.12, and this should be it. Okay, so the only difference between these two ways of doing that is that over here I'm using a dot notation, and over here I'm using the brackets notation. Now usually what happens with us is in arrays we have this way, but instead over here, when you use this way of getting access to one of the instances of an array, we use 1, 2, 3, because in instances usually are assigned values automatically, and these indexes are usually start from 0 until the length of the array. Now there is one concept that we are going to see later on. It's called an associative array, where we can assign a name instead of those indexes. So you can see over here that this is similar to that concept where you assign names to the indexes. Instead of using the index 0, 1, 2, 3, I'm using an index which is the name of the property. So this works with what we have over here. Now, so this is the way of actually creating an object using using two different methods: object literal notation, the constructor method. There are two ways of assigning values or using values from an object, and which one is suitable for you, you can use them. Both are perfectly acceptable. One is using the dot notation, and one is using the brackets notation, or the square brackets notation. Okay, now we did one half of the work right now. We created an object, we assign values to that object. Now what we are remaining with is how to create a function, or how to assign a function to that object. Because as I told you in the beginning, that in object-oriented programming, what we have over here, is a combination, encapsulation of properties and methods combined into one single instance, which is called an object. Okay, so let's look forward to how to create functions. Now I'm going to say assigning functions. Okay, assigning functions to an object. Now there are again two ways of doing that. The first way is when you assign a function specifically for an object, specifically for this object. Let me show it to you. For example, the way of doing that is, again, we use the dot notation to do that. Now what I'm going to do over here is, let's say, provide the name of the object, such as student, and I'm going to use the dot notation and provide the name of the object, a name of the function, sorry, the name of the object, and then the name of the function that I'm working with. So let's say this function allows me to update the GPA of the student. Say I have this is the name of the function, and then I use equal to, and then the same way of creating a function, which is function, and I use brackets. Now inside these brackets I can accept parameters. For example, over here, if I'm updating the GPA, I need the new GPA, which is a parameter. So I'm going to say new GPA. Okay, and then I can use the same brackets that I use, and then use assign this new GPA to this existing GPA. So for example, if I want to assign that, I'm going to use the same way, student dot GPA equal to the new GPA, and that's it. So whatever I need to do is inside this I can do anything I like with it, and then this way when I perform this function, what happens is I will assign this new GPA. So for example, let's do one thing. What we need to do is first I'm going to print out document.write. Let me just say I'm going to provide a break over here. Now what I need to do is document.write. First I print out the first structure, the GPA, let's say original GPA for student, and then to combine that with the original GPA, which is student.GPA, right, before the function actually happens. Now after that I'm going to call that function. This function is not going to work unless and until I call them. The same thing applies as we did earlier in the previous screencast. A function stays there unless and until I call it from the program. I'm just defining it over here. I'm not actually calling it, just defining it. So over here I need to call that function. So how to call that function? Same as what we did with variables. So I'm going to say student dot update GPA, and then provide the parameters that I need. So for example, I want to update the GPA from 3.75 to let's say 4.50. This is my parameter. So this is how I call the function with the values, and then what I need to do is print out the new value of print out the new value, which is updated GPA for student. Okay, and then I'm going to say plus. I'm going to use the same thing, student dot GPA, because I'm updating the original object over here. Okay, I'm going to save this. So now you see what I did is I have this object which has a property called GPA. Based on that, I'm writing a function for that object. See over here, student dot the name of the function equal to the keyword and then that list of properties. You can add more list of properties as with other functions. You can use comma and then add more properties over here if you want to. And then inside that I'm going to use that new GPA which is passed on through this function parameter and assign it to the GPA of that object. So I'm going to update this value over here now, and after that I'm going to just print it out. So for example, over here I'm going to say original GPA for the student, which is this, and then I call that function with a new value which is 4.5, and then I print out the updated GPA. Now let's go back and refresh this. You will see that the original GPA for student was 3.75. I called that function with a new value, and this is my updated GPA for that student, which is 4.5. Okay, I hope this is clear now, which is much simpler, right? Okay, now what we need to do is, this is the first way of doing that. The problem with this is I am creating a function specifically for one object. Now the thing is, I can have multiple objects which follow the same structure. Now what I need to do is I need to create a function which can work with multiple objects of the same instance, of the same type. Okay, now how do I do that? Is using the this keyword, something that is very similar to other programming languages. So I'm going to say assigning functions to an object using this keyword. Okay, now in this case I'm making it more general. So what I do is when I declare a function, I just use var the name of the function. For example, over here I'm going to say, if I use the same function update GPA, so I'm going to say update GPA equal to function. Okay, instead of over here, see, for example, I was associating the name of the object with the function. Over here I'm just going to create a new function and then say function GPA. So function and then I can pass the parameters, which is new GPA, and then what I need to do is update the value. Now the issue is I know how to update the value, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign GPA equal to new GPA. Okay, the issue is over here I was assigning it to student because I know which object I'm going to use it for. But over here I don't know which object I'm going to use it for. So in order to make sure how to do that, I use the this keyword. The this keyword works with any object which calls this, any object which calls this function, which uses this function. So this way, this is the keyword, this dot GPA. So instead of saying student dot GPA, I just say this dot GPA. So any function that I define it, any object which I define this function for will work if it has a property called GPA. Okay. Now I think this is only half of the problem. This is half, because I'm just declaring a general function over here, general function that works. Now what we need to do is assign this function to that object. So for example, over here what I do is assigning it. Now how do I assign it? Or link the object, link this function to the object. Okay. Now how do I link this? Is I use the name of the object I want to. So example, say I do it for student1 dot say update GPA. So this is the function. This is the function I want to call it. So it can be anything. For example, instead of saying update GPA, I can just say update, because this is something that I want to define by myself. I'll say equal to. Now equal this function in this object should be equal to this function, this general function that I just created. So over here it will be update GPA. That's it. So what I'm doing over here is providing a link for this function to the object that I already created. Okay. So this is the second way of doing that. This is the second way of assigning functions or associating functions to an object using the this keyword, which makes it more general. So if, for example, in future I have one more object, student2, I can still attach this function to that student2 without actually making another function of the same name. Okay, I hope this is clear. So what I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to call the same thing, but this time I'm going to do it for student1. So I'm just going to say original GPA for student1 was student1.gpa. Then I'm going to call that function. So I'm going to say student1.update. I cannot say update GPA, because now, although the general name of the function is update GPA, my exact name for that function within that object is update. So I have to call update, and let's say 4.72, and updated GPA for student1, which will be student1.gpa. Save this. Let's go back to our instance, refresh it. You will see this is the original GPA for the student was 4.12, and the updated GPA is 4.72. So it was working. Okay, so this is how we use objects in JavaScript. Just one quick go over the same thing that we discussed. The first thing, creating an object. You have two ways of doing that, using the object literal notation and using the constructors. Now we can use it object creation using this by var student, and then we have the name, GPA, and the properties of that object. With the constructor method, you don't need to assign properties or create properties and assign values to them during the initialization and during the creation part. You can do that later on. So what we need to do is we just use the var keyword, the name of the object equal to new object. Okay, and then later on we can assign the values. Assigning values to properties for the functions are done again in two different ways. The first way is using the dot notation. We just use the dot and the name of the property equal to the value of the property. Another way is using the brackets notation, square brackets to be precise. It says the name of the object, square brackets, and the name of the property within quotations. That's very important. We have to put them in quotations, and then we say equal to the value of that property. Okay. after that, we saw that this is 1/2 because as I told you, the objects is a combination or an encapsulation of properties and methods. Now, creating and assigning a function again has two different ways of doing that. One is in specific way, which allows you to create an object, create a method specifically for that object, where I put the name of the object dot the name of the function equal to the keyword function followed by the parameter in this parentheses, and then I open and close the brackets, and then I can use it as I like it. Any property of that object, I can use it within this scope. Now over here, I'm just printing out so that we can see it. So this function is just a declaration, so it doesn't work unless and until I call it. So this is where I'm calling that function, providing it with a new value for the GPA to update it. Now, what I'm going to do over here is, using this way, I was assigning a function specifically for the object student. Suppose I don't want to do that. I want to create an object, a function which is general, which can be used by any object created if it has the same structure, or if it has the same variable structure. So what I do over here is I assign functions to an object using this keyword. How do I do that? I use var the name of the function equal to function new GPA, then need space between them, and then I'll say, instead of saying student.gpa, this time, because it has to be general, I use this keyword. This keyword is replaced by whichever object is using it. So over here you see I'm using it with student1, so it will be replaced by student1.gpa. If I'm using it with student, it will be replaced by student.gpa. So it works with whichever object it's going to be associated with. So over here I'm saying student1.update equal to. So the thing is, it doesn't work only just by doing this. We have to link the object with this function. So this is the link statement. This is the linking statement, where I'm providing the name of the object dot the name of the function. Now this name of the function is not required to be exactly same as this, because they are different, because this is just the structure. This has to be same as the structure, because I'm assigning it. Over here, this is what I want to call that function within this object. So I can choose to have the same name, or I can choose to have a different name. It's up to you. And then I'm going to do that. Similar to earlier, this function doesn't work unless and until I call it from the program. This is just the declaration of that function. So I'm calling it with the same dot notation. You're passing on the value 4.72. As you can see, my original value over here was 4.12, and I updated it to 4.72, and this is what you see in the output over here, which is 4.12, and updated value was 4.72. Okay, so this is how we use objects in JavaScript. Hope you enjoyed the lecture.